Good morning. Today's hearing, From Cobalt to Cars, How China Exploits Child and Forced Labor, will come to order. The Commission knows all too well about the Chinese government's egregious human rights abuses, blatant disregard for international law, and its ever-expanding authoritarian influence beyond its borders. This influence is pervasive, felt in boardrooms and C-suites, in supply chains and on assembly lines, in classrooms and textbooks, in cities in our very own country and indeed other countries as well. Today's hearing will highlight China's malign influence in Africa, specifically in the cobalt mining industry in the Democratic Republic of Congo. China's long repressive arm is ubiquitous in the DRC. Located in Central Africa, the DRC is massive and blessed with natural resources, including metals and minerals. And of course, its greatest asset is its people, which are being exploited today by the Chinese Communist Party. It is a country that has been brutally pillaged throughout history, fueled by corrupt men's unquenchable thirst for power, riches, land, rubber, copper, palm oil, and now cobalt, all at the expense of innocent women, men, and children. The DRC is home to more than 70% of the world's cobalt, an essential metal for lithium-ion batteries powering our smartphones, laptops, computers, and electric vehicles, unless we forget our own complicity, however unwitting, through our use of such cobalt in our everyday lives. Siddharth Kara's book, Cobalt Red, and I recommend that everyone on this commission and people who are concerned about these issues read this book. Cobalt Red, How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives, vividly describes the tragic realities of this industry that has all too willingly turned a blind eye to human dignity. There is no such thing as a clean supply chain of cobalt from the Congo, says Kara. Kara writes in his book, stakeholders have formulated international coalitions to help ensure that their supply chains are clean. The two leading coalitions are the Responsible Minerals Initiative, or RMI, and the Global Battery Alliance, GBA. The GBA, he goes on, has developed a Cobalt Action Partnership to immediately and urgently eliminate child and forced labor from the cobalt value chain. Kara, however, goes on to write, in all of my time in the Congo, I never saw or heard of any activities linked to either of these coalitions, close quote. To this day, child and forced Congolese laborers toil in hazardous conditions to extract cobalt from unsafe mines, including artisanal mines in the DRC. Hastily dug, artisanal mines are always subject to collapsing, and many have indeed collapsed, crushing, amputating, and killing miners, including children. It is impossible to escape the disastrous environmental impacts of cobalt mining in these communities, as the very air they breathe and the water they drink are contaminated by toxic chemicals, dirt, and sediment. The biggest beneficiaries of this cobalt continue to remain silent and refuse to face this uncomfortable truth. From dirt to battery, from cobalt to cars, the entire system is fueled by violence, cruelty, and corruption. Therein lies, quote, therein lies the greatest tragedy of the Congo's mining provinces, says Kara. No one up the chain considers themselves responsible for the artisanal miners, even though they all profit from them. China has gained almost full dominance of every single step of the cobalt supply chain. Money talks and human rights go right out the window. Corrupt government officials in the DRC sign billion-dollar deals with China and pocket the money for themselves. Major companies, both Chinese and Western, close their eyes. Over a year ago, on July 22nd, 2022, I chaired a hearing of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission entitled Child Labor and Human Rights Violations in the Mining Industry of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And thank you, Ambassador Schultz, because you were one of our very distinguished witnesses. One of our expert witnesses at that hearing at the time, Hervé Kenyungu, testified, and I quote him in part, child labor is one of the worst forms of abuse. It is forbidden by both Congolese law legislation as well as international rules and norms. Quote, in the mining industry in my country, he went on, the Democratic Republic of Congo, children are often exposed to radioactive minerals, injuries, deadly, and painful diseases. For example, he goes on with respect to the extraction of cobalt in artisanal mines within the Mulala province. Children are routinely used as part of the workforce. They are unremunerated and exploited, and the work is often fatal, as these children are required to crawl into small holes dug in the earth to recover sacks of coal, ore, I should say, containing rich grades of heterogeneite, which is almost 60% cobalt. These children are not going to school. Their health is exposed as they are living in precarious conditions. Another witness at our hearing, also from the DRC, Father Behuzo, a Jesuit. He's the regional coordinator of the ecclesial network of the Congo Basin Forest and head of the research department at the Jesuit Center for Study and Social Action. He pointed out that their report noted that artisanal miners are not provided with any protective equipment. They work 7 days a week and more than 12 hours a day. In reality, their working hours are not defined and includes weekends and holidays. They are exposed to radiation from the products they use and to the danger of the explosives they use. Close quote. The United States has been, at best, asleep at the wheel, or worse, complicit and enabling, for far too long, and China has taken advantage of that. We need to provide alternative options that champion transparency, human rights, peace, and prosperity for all. This week, I will be introducing legislation to ensure that goods made using or containing cobalt refined in the PRC does not enter the United States market under the presumption that it is extracted or processed with the use of child and forced labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Among its provisions, the bill called the China's Odious and Brutally Atrocious Labor Trafficking Supply Chain, or Cobalt Supply Chain Act, will, and as we did with the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, requires the Customs Commissioner to apply the presumption. It's a rebuttable presumption, but a presumption unless the Commissioner determines that the importer of record of the covered goods being imported has, one, demonstrated by clear and convincing evidence that the covered goods were not made or manufactured in the PRC or using or containing cobalt, or demonstrated by clear and convincing evidence that the covered goods from the PRC contain no trace of cobalt extracted or processed in the DRC. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, as many of us know, recognizes, quote, the right of the child to be protected from economic exploitation and from performing any work that is likely hazardous. By ignoring these rights and by treating people, including children, as expendable, China is committing gross violations of human rights and are seeking to rewrite the international order, all while controlling the supply chains of this critical metal, cobalt. I'd like to now yield to the co-chair, our distinguished member from the Senate. It's great to be over in the Senate with you today, Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, I was confused about the location. I was halfway to the house before I recognized that you were coming across. So, welcome. Thank you for your passionate concern about this very real problem. Thank you for convening this hearing. It builds on several hearings that this commission has held on the issue of forced labor and other abuses, including child labor and supply chains dominated by Chinese companies, and the importance of holding them accountable when they are complicit in human rights violations. This commission regularly spotlights the repression of the Chinese government, whether within their own borders, such as Xinjiang or Hong Kong, or in Hong Kong, or through efforts to reach across borders into other countries, including right here in the United States. Today we'll hear about how these two forms of repression are entwined in the cobalt supply chain, originating in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Cobalt is a critical component in lithium-ion batteries, which are used in everything from our cell phones to our electric cars, as well as industrial and defense applications. Almost half the world's known reserves of cobalt, some 3.4 million metric tons, are in southern DRC, and the country accounts for roughly 70% of global production. A whopping 80% of DRC's cobalt output is owned by Chinese companies. It's refined in China. It's sold to companies then outside of China to the United States, Europe, elsewhere for use in batteries and other equipment. So-called artisanal cobalt mines remain largely unregulated, operating alongside larger industrial operations. Artisanal miners often include women and children who work for the equivalent of $1 or $2 a day, carry heavy loads out of dangerous mines. Children as young as 3 learning to sift through the stones to wash and sort ore. The U.S. Department of Labor estimates that at least 25,000 children are working in cobalt mines in the DRC. And they do it, as the Chairman pointed out, without basic protective equipment, gloves and face masks. A study in The Lancet found that women living in areas close to cobalt mines had, quote, metal concentrations that are among the highest ever reported for pregnant women, with heavy metals linked to stillbirths and birth defects. Cobalt mining also causes enormous environmental degradation from large-scale open-pit mines or ordinary people tearing up the ground looking for cobalt, following the veins wherever they lead. DRC isn't just a top producer of cobalt, it's also a top producer of other minerals that are vital components in batteries and other advanced technologies like copper and rare earth metals. Facilitated by widespread corruption in DRC's mining sector, Chinese companies and Chinese government directly profit from forced and child labor used to mine these minerals, extending their abusive practices across the continents. They supply American companies that produce products that all of us use every day. American consumers deserve to be protected from becoming unwitting and unwilling accomplices in these abuses. All of these issues have enormous implications for our supply chains at every step as we seek to accelerate the transition to a clean, sustainable energy future. American companies and those in like-minded countries have leverage over these tainted supply chains, which they can and must exert to improve transparency and implement responsible sourcing. And both the executive branch and Congress have important roles to play to reduce and eliminate labor and other human rights abuses in DRC mining operations. Addressing these issues is an opportunity for the United States to lead the world both in clean, sustainable energy and in human rights. I look forward to learning from our experts who are here today. Thank you for joining us and sharing your knowledge, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. On the line, we're joined by Congresswoman Commissioner Michelle Steele, and also Congresswoman Salinas is also on the line. So, Michelle, yield to you for any opening comments you might have.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for hosting this important meeting. And I want to say thank you, the witnesses, for joining today and for sharing their key insights on how China exploits child and forced labor in the Congo. I'm deeply concerned with child and forced labor tainting the supply chain of cobalt and other rare earth minerals. I have raised these concerns at other hearings and believe the United States must work with trusted allies on this issue. Many have turned a blind eye to these human and child labor abuses. I hope we all share the concern the US and Europe are reliant on the CCP for critical minerals as our government mandates EV cars in the 2030s. I'm highly concerned that this administration isn't doing enough to counter CCP influence. There are also possible environmental concerns that will occur due to increased mining in the region. The CCP only cares about the bottom line. If everyone needs to be driving new electric vehicles by 2030, as demanded by Governor Newsom in California, we need to allow for safe and clean mining within the United States. We must work together to end very harmful and severe consequences of supporting a cobalt supply chain tainted with child labor, slave labor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this timely hearing.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Steele. Congresswoman Salinas.
Thank you so much, Chair Smith and Senator Merkley, for holding this very important hearing. And thank you to our esteemed witnesses for really taking the time to be with us here today and sharing your thoughts and potential solutions to this issue. As we know, the conditions in the cobalt and lithium mines in the DRC threaten the dignity, rights, and safety of the workers who labor every day to meet the global demand for these valuable minerals and threaten to undermine the innovation and development of U.S. companies and products. This problem is of particular interest to me because just north of my district, Intel employs over 20,000 Oregonians, several thousand in my district, and they use cobalt to create their microchips and semiconductors. Intel has developed internal processes to assess and audit their global supply chain to be a responsible actor in the space. But as we roll out new programs under the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act, it is imperative that we ensure the global supply chain is not tainted with materials produced with inhumane or forced labor. So I am really looking forward to hearing more from our witnesses and my colleagues about how we can continue to innovate and electrify here, but also maintaining fair and humane labor practices in the global supply chain. So again, thank you so much for holding this hearing today.
Thank you so very much. Now, let me introduce our very distinguished panel. And we are grateful to have Ambassador Eric Schultz join us again. He is a friend who has previously testified before the Lantos Human Rights Commission, but this is his first time appearing before the China Commission. So thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Schultz is a former senior American diplomat with decades of experience in the Commonwealth of Independent States and in Southern African countries. He has worked extensively with Ukraine, Russia, Turkmenistan, Georgia, and has experience in emerging markets around the world. Ambassador Schultz served as U.S. Ambassador to Zambia. He was Deputy U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Minister Consular for Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and also Deputy U.S. Ambassador in Zimbabwe. Prior to these assignments, he has worked, again, in Georgia, Madagascar, in so many other places throughout the world. He graduated Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and holds an MA degree in International Studies from Denver University. He speaks English, French, Ukrainian, and Russian. Hopefully English will be his preferred language today. I'd like to thank Ambassador Schultz for his extensive service to our country and again for being here to give us his insights. Our next witness will be Miloš Ikovich, a law professor at Washington University in St. Louis, who teaches Introduction to Human Rights and International Criminal Law. He also served as an international arbiter and human rights advocate. Over the course of the last decade, he has been raising awareness about the deteriorating state of democracies worldwide, including ongoing illicit weaponization of trade and supply chains to target and disempower free societies. He is recognized for his extraordinary efforts and actions to eradicate the worst forms of child slavery, human rights abuses, torture, and human trafficking in Africa and throughout the world. Professor Ikovich was also involved in achieving the release of journalists wrongfully imprisoned in Africa and serves on the board of the Inter-Parliamentary Task Force on Human Trafficking. Professor, again, we appreciate the work you do on all of these issues, and I especially work so much on the trafficking issue. Greatly respect your work on that. Then we'll be joined by Joseph Mulala Neguramo, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, both for the Freedom and Prosperity Center and the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He was born and spent his formative years in the DRC. He was also the first and thus far only Congolese graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he majored in defense and strategic studies. He holds a master's degree in global theory and history from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, where he has also been co-teaching a call on modern supply chain diplomacy. Additionally, Joseph has worked as a research assistant at the Brookings Institution, where he focuses on education, as well as the Taubman Center for State and Local Government within Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, where he focused on African public policy. Joseph also worked at the International Economic Alliance, where he led the student internship program and organized meetings between governments and private sector participants to promote trade, economic growth, and development. Currently, at the Atlantic Council, he focuses on advancing democracy, quality, governance, and the rule of law, and the implications of the return of great power competition and how it is shaping the new world in the 21st century. We're grateful to have you here, and thank you for being here. Finally, we'll hear from Stavros Niarchos, also known as Nick, who is a journalist based in New York. His work focuses on minerals, migration, and conflicts. He is a regular contributor to the New Yorker magazine, which has published his work on cobalt and the DRC. His work from Ukraine won a 2023 Edward R. Murrow Award from the Radio Television Digital News Association. In addition to the DRC, Nick has written stories from Ukraine, Indonesia, Yemen, Burkina Faso, Niger, Morocco, Western Sahara, Djibouti, Iran, Uzbekistan, Bhutan, and of course, Greece. He is currently writing a book for Penguin Books about the battery metal supply that includes reporting from the United States, Europe, and in Africa. He holds an MS from Columbia School of Journalism and a BA from Yale University. On a personal note, I'm very grateful to have Nick here with us today, as he had a precarious time while in the DRC just last year. Because of his work reporting on alleged ties between mining groups and separatists in the DRC, he and a fellow journalist were detained by Congolese officials in July of 2022. My staff and I advocated for Nick's release, and we were relieved, greatly relieved, to hear that he was released 6 days later from his harrowing ordeal. And you might want to share a little bit on that, but above all, we're here to talk about, obviously, Cobalt. But I want to thank him for his speaking truth to power and doing it even when there's such a great price personally to him. Ambassador Schultz, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, it's an honor and a privilege to be here today. As Chairman Smith mentioned, about a year ago, I spoke in front of Tom Lantis' Human Rights Commission on a very similar topic. Excuse me. My presentation then characterized our relationship with China and Russia as an adversarial one, tantamount to conflict. Moreover, I argued it was a conflict we were losing, and had in fact been losing for many years. U.S. policy toward Africa through administrations of both parties has been characterized too often by neglect, I would argue. We have taken interest in Africa episodically, usually prompted by a crisis of some sort, and that interest often wanes as soon as the crisis begins to ebb, and it moves on. The result is that we left Africa for others, especially China and Russia. They have expanded their economic and political influence on the continent for decades, I would argue at our expense. Moreover, it would have been a struggle regardless. They had advantages that we lacked. China and Africa were on the right side of Africa's liberation struggles. And though that was 2 generations ago, it still matters to Africans. It always will matter. It is an obstacle that we need to overcome. Also, their governments subsidize and support their commercial ventures in a way that we do not. And they don't play fair. They abet corruption and they ignore violations of civil and political and human rights, as this hearing today focuses on. As many others have argued, the world is at an inflection point of sorts right now, riven by rivalry and by violence. China and Russia pose a systemic threat. They are allied against us, and they mean to change the world order that we helped build. Africa is one of the key battlegrounds in this conflict. To win in Africa, there are several things that we should and must do. To start with, we need to acknowledge that it is a conflict. To win in Africa, it is no longer acceptable to say that Chinese investment is simply filling in where the West was too timid or too biased to venture. The old adage of one man, one vote, one time also applies to China and Africa, to its investment. One country, for all time. The Chinese mean to freeze us out of African resources as best they can, and they have spent hundreds of billions of dollars in this effort. and Africa's resources are essential to next-generation economic growth, especially copper, rare earths, and cobalt. The Belt and Road Initiative, at least in Africa, is a transparent effort to gain the upper hand and assert dominion in Africa on the part of the Chinese. There are few African countries that have not taken money and that are not in China's debt. Russia's role is smaller, but I would argue no less malign. Whether or not Wagner still exists is beside the point. Russian mercenaries and Russian arms merchants are ubiquitous in Africa. Nor should it be acceptable to be on our opponents' payrolls. Neither China nor Russia has real private companies. Working for a Chinese or a Russian company means working for their governments. We are not immune in the US from what they call the Schroederization of Europe's elites. Many American businessmen, consultants, retired government officials, and the like have taken Chinese and Russian money and have aided their efforts. We also need to change the way our government and businesses work together abroad, especially in Africa. We are a private sector economy and are stronger for it, but in many places in Africa, the investment risk is high enough that government support needs to be overt to convince American companies to invest. The argument that we can pick winners among American companies should no longer be an excuse for inaction. Supporting American companies should be one of, if not the principal task, of American foreign policy. The Development Finance Corporation is a good start to making that support more tangible, but it needs to be more active, to have fewer constraints on what it can support, and above all, it needs to have more money. Its job should be to expand the reach and influence of the American government by expanding the reach and influence of American commerce. It should not make the perfect the enemy of the good. The US government itself should be cautious about imposing its views on Africans. Supporting democracy and human rights have to be at the center of US foreign policy, but not at the expense of friendships, because friendship is the key to winning in Africa, and for that matter, everywhere else. Less finger-wagging, more listening. More recognition of the way the world is, and less dreaming of the way we want it to be. The US is and always has been a better friend and a better ally than our rivals. At the end of the day, that is how we win. When an Indian company, for instance, has its mine expropriated in Africa, our response should not be to ignore the situation or to blame the victim. It should be to help the company of a friendly country. And when African countries find themselves in trouble, deep in debt, often as not the result of the corruption of previous regimes, we need to be more active in helping. Chinese debt is still rising in Africa, even if investment itself is tailing off. The problem now and for decades to come is the vast sums owed and the interest rates that cause those sums to compound and continue rising with no real prospect that the debts can ever be repaid. And China doesn't forgive. The IMF is a useful institution, but using it to help countries meet their debt payments to Africa seems counterproductive. Wouldn't it be better to help African countries organize to negotiate as a group to press China for better terms, including especially the forgiveness of some loans, at least of those that can demonstrably be shown to be odious and the consequence of corruption? The global South, including especially Africa, is rising in importance. Its clout growing in a polarized world. A New York Times headline the other day said it all. By 2050, 1 in 4 people will be African. And their economies are also among the fastest growing. Africa's friendship matters. PEPFAR was a great initiative 20 years ago. It saved millions of African lives. However, Africans tend to take it for granted now and are more interested or more impressed by China's infrastructure projects, however poorly built and misconceived. We can do better. We should do better. My favorite proverb, Chinese, ironically, but taught to me by Africans, says that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So today is a good time to start fighting for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Ikovich.
Thank you, Chairman. Congressman Smith, Senator Merkley, honorable members of the Commission, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. The story of Cobalt is an unfortunate example of de facto informed silence and continued inaction in response to the worst devastation of basic human rights of the most vulnerable. It has been 14 years since the Department of Labor added cobalt mine in the DRC to its list of commodities produced by child or forced labor. Since then, it is estimated that anywhere between 35,000 and 40,000 children, some as young as 6 to 9, have been continuously involved in diverse mining operations in the DRC. In addition to life-threatening hazardous conditions, children are subjected to inhumane working hours of up to 24 hours each day, exposure to potentially toxic materials, physical abuse, and sexual exploitation. And yet, instead of receiving protection over the years, the DRC National Army itself was recently declared, and I quote, complicit in the worst forms of child labor, end of quote. At the same time, forced mining expanded to include other minerals in the Congo. Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index of 2022 ranked the DRC among the 15 most corrupt nations worldwide, with significant reports connecting corruption to the country's mining sector. Unfortunately, these truly horrific practices are unlikely to change until and unless incentives and impunity for wrongdoing are removed. Recognizing that the assumption of a simple solution does not do justice to the actual complexity of the matter, the remainder of my testimony seeks to address the various underlying causes of the crisis at hand, coupled with the powers available to the United States to counteract in line with its current policies. The upstream segment of the cobalt supply chain generally includes mining, mineral trading, and subsequent processing in smelters and refineries. There are two distinct sets of considerations which can be observed on the ground in the DRC. On the one hand, absolute poverty affects 60 million Congolese who have to live on less than $2.15 a day. In addition, 33 million Congolese have limited to no access to drinking water, and 43% of children up to the age of 5 across the country suffer from malnutrition. Free education remains largely unavailable. It is rather impossible to speak of free will in such a state of effective survival. Hence, the families become a target for exploitation or worse. Children who end up working in cobalt mines are paid as little as $1 to $2 a day. They may additionally be subjected to extortion by local law enforcement and security guards. To put it in simple terms, the only source of income for these people is participation in the circle of abuse. The other side of the same coin, of the same upstream coin, is the demand. Over 70% of world supply of cobalt comes from the DRC. Between 20 and 30% of those quantities may be traced back to the mines powered by child labor. Traders purchase cobalt and then sell it on to processing plants, meaning that it is often inevitable that illegally obtaining cobalt will be mixed into the mass of exported minerals. In 2020, Chinese companies imported nearly 90% of their cobalt needs from the DRC. It is publicly known that at least 8 out of 14 largest cobalt mines in the DRC are controlled by Chinese companies, but the actual number is likely to be much higher. In addition, mainland China accounts for 80% of the world's cobalt refining capacity. The downstream segment of the cobalt supply chain generally includes manufacturing activities, the activities that we face in the United States, such as components, lithium-ion batteries coming into EV vehicles. In 2020 alone, 41% of all batteries globally were imported from China. US battery imports were even more significant, reaching 47% in the same year. I would like to underline this. These figures suggest an absolute monopoly on what has become one of the most critical supply chains and may help explain why years of reporting on the link between worse forms of child labor and the cobalt supply chain have regularly fallen on deaf ears. Since 2020, I have to say, manufacturing activity has been aggressively attracted to the United States, and this is indeed a big step in the right direction. However, despite its obvious potential, it does not address the rest of the upstream issues, which necessarily remain tied to DRC and abusive practices in its mining sector. From the corporate perspective, there has been public signals of willingness to act and remedy the situation. However, these promises of change may have fallen desperately short of expectations. In 2017, Amnesty International concluded that the majority of downstream companies had taken minimal to no action to improve their due diligence on the issue of child labor. Just 2 years later, a report cited by OECD found, and I quote, "low levels of due diligence disclosure with none of 42 companies examined having described the steps taken to manage risk or summarize their risk mitigation strategies related to child labor." The German government reaffirmed in 2022 that up to 30% of cobalt in the DRC will continue to come from the mines powered by child labor. While in the same year, the Department of Labor announced minimal progress in efforts to eliminate the worst forms of child labor in the DRC. So what can be done? On one hand, corporate pressure is theoretically possible, and it requires a high degree of market dominance or importance, which can be then translated into pressure on upstream actors to aggressively address child labor in the cobalt supply chain. Nonetheless, the argument that Western companies today themselves currently have the power or incentive to force Chinese-backed counterparts to comply with international standards is absurd. As noted above, Chinese companies control almost all the mines and refineries needed to produce batteries. In addition, China is expected to remain the world's largest EV market in the short term, with a market share of up to 45%. Finally, current projections suggest that Chinese EV manufacturers will gain over 20% of the global market share by 2030. Another commercial reality is that the current supply chain is simply affordable, and any readjustment could well lead to higher costs and negatively affect the prices of final products. Therefore, in the absence of, and I underline, positive incentives, such as non-market interventions and direct governmental support, Western companies may have little motive to enter additional segments such as refining or mining themselves. Secondly, notwithstanding positive actions, so long as crimes go unpunished and actors responsible for the worst forms of child labor enjoy effective immunity, it is difficult to expect rapid and meaningful change. Hence, a careful consideration of tangible consequences has to take place. The first one has been mentioned by Chairman, and this is potentially a temporary suspension of international trade or import of cobalt-related products into the United States. The positive effects of such an act are that the US, by virtue of its market position, can exert far more dominant pressure than commercial actors themselves independently, and thus influence the triggering of remedial market practices. It should be noted, however, that an absolute ban on imports may have negative short-term effects on the US market, an issue that can be resolved as drafted in the Countering China's Exploitation of Strategic Minerals and Child Labor in the DRC Act through licensing and due diligence requirements. The second, and observing the sheer scale of uninterrupted violations of fundamental human rights for over more than a decade and potentially lethal nature of the worst forms of child labor in the DRC, are the sanctions on states, companies, and individuals involved in these practices. And the third one are criminal investigations. Let it be clear that not only I, but many of my colleagues believe that child labor in hazardous conditions constitutes a violation of peremptory norms of international law and have to be criminally prosecuted. Secondly, inhumane acts intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental health, if widespread or systematic and directed against civilian population, are crimes against humanity. So we arguably have a legal obligation to act. Finally, the local Congolese population should be given alternatives to forced mining. Let there be no doubt, artisanal mining cannot be made safer or more humane. As somebody who has personally seen this suffering, as a father whose young children, if born in the DRC, could have ended up in the same cycle of abuse, and as a true believer in the rule of law, I ask you to consider a series of actions that can put an end to the worst forms of child labor in the DRC. I also take a moment to note that the US Congress and the US administration are truly the last human hope for all of these millions of people. Thank you very much for your attention.
Mr. Ikovich, thank you so much for that testimony and those recommendations. I'd like to now recognize Joseph Neguramo.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and the Wood Commission. I am truly honored and humbled to be given this opportunity to share with you my understanding of the Asian issues affecting my home country, the DRC. As a member of African diaspora and working with the Atlantic Council.
Joseph, could you put your mic on? Thank you.
Sorry. Can I restart again? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Thank you, Chairman Smith and the Wood Commission. I am truly honored and humbled to be given this opportunity to share with you my understanding of the Asian issue affecting my home country, the DRC. As a member of the African diaspora and working with the Atlantic Council, I am on the future of U.S. and China-Africa relations and this new era of global power competition. I follow this issue closely. The working condition of women and children in the Congolese mine constitute a humanitarian tragedy. They are dehumanizing, degrading, and represent modern-day slavery and worse. African children are exploited like slaves to serve a global market for new and cleaner energy. Children under 10 years old are forced to carry bags of sands weighing up to 60 kilograms. These bags are then shipped to China for refinery to extract cobalt and copper, critical minerals that enable the global energy transition from fossil fuel to clean energy. Over 40,000 children are reported to work in these mines, mostly without pay, typically less than $10 a day, by the way, you would have mentioned this in this speech. They pick up rocks with bare hands and are without shoes. They have no adequate protective gears, they are exposed to contaminations, and they have no medical assurance. They work in tunnels, which often collapse and then die under rubble. Stories of people beaten up in these mines because they are claiming for their rights are unacceptable. Besides the unacceptable humanitarian cost, there is as well environmental degradation affecting the health of the population living in these vicinities. Credible scientific reports have shown that the exposure to toxic chemical and waste dumped by mining operations leading to cancer, lung disease, and DNA modification, according to Amnesty International. Most of the cobalt mines in the DRC are owned by Chinese companies. For example, 15 out of 19 companies operating in Katanga are Chinese. The DRC supplies about 70% of cobalt to the global markets, and 30% of that cobalt originates in what is called artisanal sector mining. Small-scale mining that relies on non-industrial tools and manual labor, characterized by a lack of transparency, accountability, and rampant corruption. The humane mining of cobalt is facilitated by the poverty, corruption, lack of quality governance, and the rule of law in the DRC. Sadly, China and the private sector artisanal mining company have taken advantage of the vulnerability of the Congolese populations and found willing collaborators among the ranks of the DRC government officials. The DRC government has been mostly complicit with mining exploitation, and it promises to revise the 2008 Chinese mining contract have barely brought concrete results. So what can be done? We should work on reducing Chinese dominance in the DRC mining sector while mitigating the global reliance on the Belt Road Initiative by applying the strategy of de-risking and diversification of our supply chain. Particularly, we must address the issue of child labor and the corruption as proposed by the way, Congressman Smith here, to ban certain goods made with child labor or forced labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo to enter the United States, Mexico, and the Canada markets. To that end, I propose the following. Advancing an aggressive implementation and expansion of the African Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA, U.S. International Development Financial Cooperation, and the Prosperous Africa programs. Reinforcing and improving the public-private partnership, government across the board working with big tech companies and even development and financial institutions with direct impact and influence the market should all use the leverage, incentive, and tools to ensure a clean supply chain, no taint with child labor, corruption, and human rights abuses. We should pressure China through our strategic engagement to practice due diligence into dealing with the DRC government and the private sector companies to prevent human exploitations. After all, China has a vested interest in being seen as a responsible producer of goods, especially once aware of the human cost of Congolese mining are widely known. Enforcing the DRC laws. The DRC government must ensure that existing laws are fully enforced. The DRC government official implicating collusion with businesses that engage in human practice must be prosecuted and held accountable. There should be sanctions. U.S. and private sector engagement in the DRC must be conditional upon the upholding of humanitarian guidelines set forth by international and Congolese laws. We should encourage and assist the DRC to establish itself as a key player in the global green energy revolution. Countries like South Korea, Finland, and Latvia have proven to be model for electronic and cyber innovations. Given its abundant resources, cheap labor, access to trade routes, and location at the center of Africa, the DRC could become the leader in responsible cobalt productions and the hub for electronic manufacturing. As such, the DRC would provide the Western market with an alternative to China. And here, by the way, I'd like to mention about as well the African Continental Trade Agreement, which I think will offer a lot of opportunity for the future American companies. We should support and protect independent and credible reports, research, and the whistleblowers. We should keep working and supporting independent, credible civil society movement that can report about the issues with credibility. We should promote democracy and the rule of law with special focus on the upcoming DRC elections. The elections are an opportunity to ensure legitimacy of national institutions, without which instability, poor governance, lawlessness persist. A strong, dynamic, resilient, and a thriving democracy in the DRC constitutes a U.S. national security interest. As a matter of fact, the Bridge to Act Congo bill, introduced by Congressman John James, must be ratified and become a U.S. official policy and strategy toward the DRC and the region. And here, of course, I'd like as well to recognize the letter that Senator Coons and Chairman McCall wrote, I think about 3 days ago, about the upcoming DRC elections. And lastly, investing in education. As Nelson Mandela once remarked, education is the most powerful tool to change the world. Children must have access to quality education and not be caught between the global race to energy transition and global power competition. Thank you for being, sir, gentlemen, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much. The commission will have to take a very brief break, recess. There's a vote on the floor. I have 1 minute to get to the House, so I'm going to run. And there's one right after it, but I'll be back in about 15 minutes or so. So I apologize, but I do have to go, and I'll be right back, hopefully with some other members. Commission will resume its sitting, and again, I apologize for that delay. We did have 2 votes. And Commissioner Ryan Zinke is here, former Secretary of the Interior and now a member of Congress. And thank you, Ryan, for joining us and for your leadership on this commission. I'd like to now, Alyssa, you want me to go to you or? Okay. I'd like to now go to Nick Niarchos for his testimony.
Chairman Smith, Chairman Merkley, and all other members of the Commission, thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm here to testify about the environmental impact of copper cobalt mining in the southern DRC. I'm happy to talk about other things and questions, but I was asked to talk about the environmental impact. I visited the DRC 6 times between 2019 and 2022, reporting for The New Yorker, The Nation, and Antelope magazines, and for an upcoming book. On each of these trips, I have seen the intense environmental degradation and deleterious effects of the practice on the health of the local population. Copper and cobalt are 2 key materials for the creation of lithium-ion batteries, electric devices, and especially for the electrification of transport, which is an important factor in the reduction of fossil fuel emissions and the slowing of climate change. But the question we must ask ourselves is whether the harm done by the extraction of these metals, and indeed the fossil fuels expended in their mining, transport, processing, and so on, does not outweigh the benefit. Is the juice worth the squeeze? Too often have natural environments been destroyed in the name of progress, and too often have the lives of people far from the cities in which the minerals are consumed been destroyed. The local population does not benefit, and they are left with little more than holes in the ground. There is even a term for these places. They are known as sacrifice zones. In reporting for The Nation and for The New Yorker, I have seen how landscapes in Congo, Indonesia, and the Western Sahara have been destroyed, water polluted, and air filled with dust and carbon as mining companies rush to extract minerals like copper, cobalt, lithium, and phosphates. Oftentimes, human rights abuses go hand in glove with these environmental catastrophes. In Congo, the Miombo forests of the southern savanna have been cut back, and the land looks as if it has been bombed. I have also seen that there are ways to mine responsibly, ways in which mining can be done in what is known as a closed loop. Sadly, these examples are exceptions to the rule. An environmental catastrophe is underway in the southern DRC. The rush to produce devices, batteries, and electric products more cheaply have created a demand for the metals that has led to more and more unscrupulous behavior. Chinese firms and traders are at the forefront of these practices. There is a saying in Congo, if they don't give their workers shoes in their own country, why would they give us shoes here? In Congo, there are 2 types of mine, although there are many gradations between these 2. There are industrial mines, they use modern and mechanized methods, and they are responsible for the majority of the cobalt that comes out of the DRC. The industrial mines I've been allowed to visit, including the giant Komoto Copper Company mine near Kolwezi, that's owned by Glencore, have emphasized their environmental mitigation efforts. However, I was not permitted to visit the giant Tenke Fungurume mine, or TFM, located between the towns of Lekasi and Kolwezi, and operated by the giant Chinese firm CMOC, or China Moly. Other journalists have also been subjected to harassment while visiting the Tenke Fungurume site. I visited an adjacent site where small-scale miners showed me polluted rivers in which women washed clothes and minerals. A 2021 report by the NGO Save the Children showed white residue flowing out from the TFM site. Now, this morning I spoke to my friend Hugh Kinsella-Cunningham, who's a photojournalist. He's out in DRC at the moment, and he contributed to that report. And he told me at the village of Mulundu, he saw white residue blanching the fields, and that residents there complained that their crops were dying and that they had to wash in polluted water. The second type of mine in Congo is the artisanal mine. Artisanal miners are people who mine for themselves or small cooperatives. Before sale at these depots, but in some cases after, the ore is crudely processed by washing it in local water supplies. Studies show that fish in rivers in the mining provinces have been contaminated with heavy metals and uranium. At the village of Samukinda, I saw how cobalt washing, as well as effluent from a factory processing copper and cobalt, had destroyed fields. The chief of the village, Rikomeno Samukinda, explained that they could no longer grow food there, and that more and more of the villagers had to take risky mining jobs in order to provide for their families. In southern Congo, women wash raw mining material, which is often full of toxic materials and in some cases is mildly radioactive. If a pregnant woman works with such heavy metals as cobalt, it can increase her chances of having a stillbirth or a child with birth defects. We've heard from Senator Merkley about the 2020 study in the Lancet showing that women in southern Congo had metal concentrations that are among the highest ever reported for pregnant women. They also find a strong link between fathers who worked in mining and fetal abnormalities in their children. What's more, children as young as 3 mine and handle the toxic ore. They are sometimes drugged and deprived of food. These factors all contribute to developmental disorders and reduce life expectancy in the mining regions of the DRC. In March 2022, I spent a day with Dr. Billy Mukong, a local physician in the mining town of Kolwezi. As Dr. Mukong did his rounds, he introduced me to women whose children were born with defects. Some had swollen heads, some were developmentally disabled. The defects, he said, were thanks to exposure to dust that has blown off the back of trucks carrying raw and processed ore around Kolwezi. The depots where the ore is collected are often run by foreign traders. Many are Chinese, in fact, most are Chinese. There are also some Lebanese and Indian nationals who have settled in the region. Some of the depots are owned by or supply larger depots owned by international mining companies. The most prominent of these is Congo Dongfang Mining. CDM is a subsidiary of Huayu, a Chinese-based company that has supplied cobalt to firms like Apple and Samsung. CDM has said that they have made efforts to clean up their supply chain and ensure that children, for example, are not mining cobalt. But last year, I traveled from an illegal mine site outside the town of Fungurume with a local dealer in copper and cobalt ore who pointed out where he sold his product, completely unregulated product. The site was owned by CDM, who could not possibly have controlled how the ore was mined or who mined it. When cobalt is collected, it is processed into hydroxide. This is often done inside the DRC, but sometimes the unprocessed product is shipped out on a flatbed truck. At the Kasumbalesa border post, trucks idle for days until they are allowed out of the country. People in the towns complain of severe asthma. At processing facilities in China and in Korea, this material can be mixed with industrial product. More needs to be done to trace this supply chain and ensure the rights of the people at the very bottom of it. The bottom of the supply chain is rife with human rights abuses, as we have heard. Such abuses also happen to journalists and investigators. As has been noted in my own work, I was disappeared and detained for 6 days by the Democratic Republic of the Congo's government as I tried to shed light on some of the abuses I document above. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the members of this committee and others in the US government who helped secure my release. I want to note that some Congolese journalists are not so lucky. The journalist Stani Bukajera Chiamala languishes in jail for a report that he reportedly did not even write, and more must be done to promote transparency and thorough reporting on the supply chain, which firms and governments would rather keep secrets. I'd like to close quickly with a thought or two about solutions. Banning Congolese cobalt, it's a good idea on the face of it, but it needs to be coupled with action to create jobs in the province. Without provision of an alternative form of employment, it could harm the poorest people in that nation. In the DRC, we've seen how bands of tantalum and tin ore have contributed to criminality instead of curbing it, so new solutions must be envisaged. They have also empowered unscrupulous traders who deal in falsified tags. Let's try and not make the same mistake again. Let me be clear that the consuming countries need to provide real solutions to address the lack of work in places like the DRC, to provide alternatives to artisanal mining, or at least to make it safer and cleaner. Countries like the US need to insist on environmental protections and on recycling to recover critical metals. We also need to ensure that democracy and the rule of law are upheld. As Congo moves towards its elections this December, I believe the United States should insist on a free and a fair voting process as the bedrock of any state of law. This will be key in regulating this industry and making sure that value can be shared with some of the poorest people in the world. Thank you for your time today, and forgive me for going over.
Mr. Diarchis, thank you for your testimony, and we're glad you're safe. And thank you for doing a strong appeal for those journalists who do remain in prison, especially the Congolese. So thank you. Commissioner Zinke?
Thank you. As a former secretary and looking at lithium, cobalt, and this series of critical minerals that DNRC, and by the way, I've been to DNRC and it's struggling. Just to say, I would say that would be kind on there. But there was some efforts, I understand, by Ford Motor Company, IBM, on using blockchain on cobalt particularly to try to look at where it's coming from. Are you aware of any of those efforts as far as blockchain being used in technology to make sure that the cobalt and critical minerals, there's a supply chain and we can follow it through from beginning to end?
The question is to me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the question. Yes, I'm aware of many of these efforts. There are several different programs to do so.
And I'll open up the panel. Is anyone else aware of those efforts?
Yes, sir. Though I would like to note that trying to trace back the payments is not the only way to go about it. We have a serious problem that the entire refining is in China, and that most of the mines are controlled by China. So the underreported cobalt that ends up in China being refined and being shipped into the United States is the actual problem. It is not how to administratively address the issue of payments themselves. And in my view, to say that this cobalt coming from 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old kids is not landing in the United States is an absurd argument. It's certainly not a serious one, because mathematically it cannot be backed.
So what do you think the percentage is?
So we don't need to think. We can see the reports. More than 80% of world refineries are in China.
In particular on child labor being used on cobalt, the percentage, what do you guess it to be?
So the reports today say that anywhere around 40,000 kids, 6 years onwards, work in these illegal sites, and proceeds of their work land in the supply chain. This is a matter of public record, and Department of Labor confirmed it.
How does that translate, if you would, your guess on the amount of cobalt, what percentage is from child
So German government in 2022 said that from artisanal mines, which include mines where people work or kids work, at least 30% of the world cobalt coming from the DRC is coming from these sites. It's a huge amount. And this is 2022 report of the German government.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. You're back. Thank you.
Commissioner Nunn?
Well, first off, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you bringing together this august panel. And to the panel yourselves, thank you for taking the time to share with us. I think this is something that has sprung up on the front pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, but really doing a deep dive to see the impact of this on our communities is chilling. I want to talk specifically about the Communist Party's extensive use of forced child labor in the world's cobalt industry. In the pursuit of innovation and the creation of cutting-edge technologies that we use here every day in the United States, we have inadvertently become consumers that bear the product of heavy exploitation, many of it coming from children around the world. One such example is the extraction of cobalt, a vital component in the batteries that power everything from our devices here to so many of the cars that we see on the road today, here in the United States. And tragically, this extraction of cobalt is often tainted by the stain of child labor. The numbers are simply staggering. 80% of the world's cobalt output is owned by Chinese companies. Chinese imports, 63% of the world's cobalt. And as we just heard, more than 30% of the cobalt being extracted is coming from artisanal mines that would exploit child labor. Nearly 25,000 children are used to mine this rare earth metal. Now, as a dad of 6 who just was fortunate to get to adopt 2 young girls this year, I cannot imagine the cruelties and the hardships that these children are being exploited to daily in the mine that is being forced to extract this. I'm appalled, as this commission has long been, on the use by the CCP of child labor in these horrific mining situations. The truth of the matter is that during Xi Jinping's authoritarian expansion, he has used his notorious Belt and Road Initiative, and the Chinese Communist Party has swept up millions of unwilling individuals to fuel their economic regime, something that both Republicans and Democrats have called out as to be completely untenable. And yet, here he is in the United States, attempting to expand influence on our energy production in America. Today, we examine specific instances of where the Chinese Communist Party has used forced child labor to supply the world's electronics with cobalt, and I want to thank our witnesses. So getting into it, Ambassador, you have been on the front line. Mr. Schultz, you have seen the wolf warriors that come from Beijing and their attempt to pressure other countries around the world to following their economic advantage. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, first, just the scene setter on how the Belt and Road Initiative has contributed to the cobalt disaster that the rest of the world is now facing today.
Thank you for the question. So my expertise probably isn't as good as Milos and some of the other witnesses in terms of the nitty-gritty, the details of the cobalt industry. But what I can give you is kind of, sorry, yeah, of course I can. But I can talk a little bit about what I saw in Africa when I served there and how China works there, right? So, in fact, we were just discussing it at the break that, you know, China provides money to Africa, at least in theory. The whole Belt and Road Initiative is, you know, I think I misspoke earlier when I said that they've devoted millions of dollars to preventing or trying to exclude the United States from African markets. It's of course, billions, right, and probably tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions. So the way it works, actually, in simple terms, is, you know, like the Chinese come to an African country and they say, we think you need a road from point A to point B. We're willing to finance it. We'll give you a project loan to build that road. But in return for that money, you have to agree to sole source. So it has to be a Chinese company. It has to be Chinese labor. It has to be Chinese materials, Chinese equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So in fact, there's really there's no follow-on effect in the local economy because no local people are working on the projects. It's only Chinese labor that's brought into the country, and often is demobilized in place. And so you end up with a Chinese minority in an African country where it never existed before.
Ambassador, you would say then that all roads in the Belt and Road Initiative really are leading to Beijing. I mean, at the end of the day...
Yes, that's a very nice way of putting it. I would say that, yes.
And I would concur with you on this. Look, at this point, we are offering, or China is by all means economically exploiting other countries.
Well, I think it's fair to say that it's a debt trap,
right?
You know, and what the sweetener is, of course, is that they're offering the government in power money under the table. So in Zambia, when I was ambassador there, it was pretty clear that the previous government, you know, that there were officials in it that were getting a piece of the pie. So they were being paid to accept these, you know, these projects that the country really didn't need. I mean, in fact, we were just talking a moment ago that Zambia has 2 brand new airports, or virtually brand new. Both of them were built for close to $1 billion, the 2 of them together. And, you know, there are no airplanes because, I mean, one of them is in the northern part of the country, Ndola. No one flies there, really, to speak of. So you've got this huge Chinese-built airport that's empty, and even the airport in Lusaka is not heavily used. On top of which, the other problem with Chinese projects is that they're not necessarily well-built. So they tend to deteriorate fairly rapidly. In Zambia, the locals call the roads, Chinese roads, painted. You know, because they're like painted with black paint, right? And so the first time you hit heavy rainfall, they start to wash out. You know, meanwhile, of course, you've got billions and billions and billions of dollars of debt that's been put on the country's credit card that has to be paid back.
Right. And I think that's really what we're focusing on. You used the words death trap. I think you're absolutely right. It's economic hostage-taking that they've indebted these countries to and then bridled them with a modern-day colonialism to exploit some of their most precious commodities, this in the case of their children. But they're also using those exploitations to go after rare earth minerals in the form of cobalt. I want to speak here to Professor Ikovich here. Milos, you talked in a recent report that shows violence in Congo has displaced approximately 7 million people. What does that mean for those left behind today and the type of forced labor they're required to do in the machination of Chinese cobalt exploitation?
That means that they don't have any alternative but to work as slaves.
So now we have both economic hostage-taking and human exploitation happening on the same hand. Will the factions in charge of these mines refill employees with other parts of the world, or are they going to continue to dig into an exploited underclass, largely children, in your opinion?
Absolutely, not only children, but all the underprivileged. As I mentioned in my testimony, almost 60 million Congolese live with under $2.15 a day. They're forced to work as slaves. We talk about effective slavery under international law.
And China's even gone beyond this indentured servitude or slave labor, as you highlight locally, but they're starting to bring in others from, exploited masses around the world. Uyghurs from China, dissidents from North Korea, people that they find untenable, they send to work basically to death in these cobalt mines in the heart of Africa. Is that correct?
That is exactly correct, and our problem is not enforcing U.S. laws which are already on the record. It is not as if we need new bills to remedy the situation. These grave circumstances are already covered by federal legislation. It is just that we do not have enforcement which would stop the supply chain. So long as there is demand, there will be slavery.
I'd like to turn next to you, Joseph. One of the things you highlighted here with the Atlantic Council is how conflicts around the world could increase China's superiority over the West, including the United States, with owning the vast majority of cobalt and how dependent the rest of the world has become on it. Could you talk a little bit on where China really has a chokehold on this rare earth mineral that the rest of the world could not make up if there were to be sanctions or if there were, God forbid, a conflict directly with mainland China and the United States?
Yes, sir, absolutely. Well, the more I've been thinking about this situation, particularly child labor and let's say the whole equation of how the global economy has been working over the past 30 years and how we basically got ourselves into these situations, that we are heavily dependent on China, particularly in terms of products such as semiconductors, which derive from DRC cobalt and lithium and copper, sadly, with child labor and the human rights exploitations. So the thing, first we have to be, I think, frank in terms of looking at the problems, how we got here. We have to understand the problem, how do we get here, and have the courage and the leadership as well to try to address the problems. And of course, it's a very complex equation, so we cannot solve it in, let's say, one day or maybe 5 or 10 years. But I'm very encouraged as well to see, all these, engagement here, and I think I've read some, great documents that the U.S. government is putting forward in terms of addressing these issues, such as if you read the U.S. National Security Strategy, I think the bill that the congressman is putting as well. So I think this kind of initiative approach that would help us to kind of maybe, step by step, creating a new strategy so that the United States is not dependent on China, especially if there is a conflict. Because quite frankly, right now we are very vulnerable. And let's just put it very straightforward. If there is a conflict with China, China can just cut off the supply of semiconductors and our defense is exposed.
Absolutely.
So the last thing we don't want to do is just to get into those positions. So that's a problem. And I like to say as well that yes, engaging these countries like the DRC is very difficult for different reasons. Let's say the lack of rule of law, quality governance, But here's the thing, and again, I'd like really to mention this actually. I'm really, really supportive of the bill that the Congressman, I think, James put it here before. And here's for obvious reasons. I read it, and I read the Congressman bill as well. So actually, I feel like they're kind of complementary, actually, right. Because the John James bill actually says, like, we should take as a national security U.S. priorities, to make sure the DRC is stable, the entire region. I think that's now actual national security interest. It addresses what this child labor, but not in the extent as Congressman Smith's bill. So I like to think that we should somehow maybe combine both, see what's good in one bill, what's good in the other bill, and really have a more coherent, comprehensive bill on the floor. And hopefully that will be the base of strategy dealing with not only the DRC, but the entire region. And hopefully in the longer term, we'll be able to somehow take a more, let's say, balanced or maybe approach, let's put it that way, in case we we are getting into trouble with China. And honestly, we are seeing what's happening in Ukraine, with Russia. These countries tend to weaponize these kind of tools, and they're very vulnerable. So thank you so much.
So I'd just like to, again, thank the chairman. Chairman Smith, you have led a dedicated effort to hold the Chinese accountable for what they've done internal to the People's Republic, as well as what they've done externally. And in this tragic case of exploiting children, you have brought this to the forefront. There are so many, I think, incredibly timely things that the United States needs to do on a strategic level to be able to not only counter China, but really this mass amount of child exploitation that's happening in the world on a rare earth mineral. So I want to ask the panel very quickly, writ large here, strategically, what things can we be doing to hold Xi Jinping accountable on this front and our allies, and to offer a better lifeline to those countries in Africa that want to come into the global economic success story that has been the rest of the world without feeling that they have to be economically held hostage or that they are in a death spiral that they cannot get out of with China's One Belt, One Road initiative? I'd open it up to the panel.
Well, I would say two things, actually, that I mentioned in my testimony. The first is I think we should be providing more money through the Development Finance Corporation. We should actually be competing with China to provide project loans to help build needed infrastructure in Africa, but do a better job of it than the Chinese do, giving them infrastructure that they actually need and building it well, and doing it at a cost that they can afford. The second thing is I think we should be pretty proactive, frankly, about helping African countries get out from under China's debt. In 2011, the HIPC process basically wiped out the debt of most countries, in Africa. And we were major players in that along with the European countries. I think that China basically needs to take a haircut. They have been, kind of force-feeding these debts, these loans into these countries. They now have tens of billions of dollars that they'll never be able to pay off. They should be encouraged to basically write those debts off.
So looking at this problem, we have two perspectives. First one is U.S. national security, which I think is in danger. This supply chain shows that the U.S. cannot object to the practices because it is so heavily dependent. And in order to address the national security perspectives, first we need friends, as Ambassador said. And for everybody who has ever been to the DRC, to Zambia, to the countries in the region, if you go to the villages, these people are U.S. friends. Mm-hmm. They adore the United States, and they're hopeful that this body and the U.S. administration will actually protect them. What we need to do is show our friendship back. Apart from stating we are there from you, there is nothing else happening. These people need roads, they need schools, they need hospitals. Right. Nothing is happening. So we need to be there, also helping them help themselves. Yeah. The second issue is we need to help our companies operate in the region of Africa and in the supply chain. Currently, without governmental support, we will not have US companies being engaged. There is zero chance. Their incentive is legally jeopardized because they can face investigation and criminal prosecution. Even their subcontractors did something wrong in Africa, while we have practices of child abuse which are not prosecuted at all. So they do not want to go into these regions. And secondly, it is very affordable to keep this supply chain active. So we do need a non-market intervention immediately in the supply chain. Let me be very clear. If we want to build a refinery, we need a refinery because all refineries are in China. If we want them to be built by US companies, and the US companies can't build them because they developed patents for these refineries, they need support from the government. They cannot be led into belief that they can compete in the market with Chinese prices because they cannot. So they will have a loss of 2 to 3 years on their investment unless the government steps in. And then we need to address these atrocities. There are some sanctions on the record, but by far not addressing all the actors involved in these abuses. There is almost no criminal prosecution on the record, even though we are talking about crimes against humanity and crimes which are very similar to slavery under international law. So long as we are silent and we allowed impunity for actions, and we do that because our national security is jeopardized, there won't be a solution to this issue.
Very good.
Thank you.
Congressman, I don't really understand well the last part of the questions, so again, if you could repeat again, please, that would be great.
Strategic solutions to counter China's exploitation in Africa.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. So first of all, Ambassador Charles and even they've already mentioned it, I'll just maybe add a few elements about that. I think we have already a solid base of, let's say, strategic documents and framing these issues. And I'm really encouraged that actually a bipartisan approach. Because if you look, let's say, the previous administration, the Trump administration, this administration, the Biden administration, they've actually kept in place or keep going with certain decisions that they were taken before related to these issues. Here's the thing. So if we don't lead, nobody's will ever do it. We have got to understand that. And actually, this, as Bill just mentioned here, a lot of people in the DRC actually, interestingly enough, they always look up the United States actually for help and support, actually. They do, actually, which is so interesting in many ways. And I think that for obvious reasons, they think that, the U.S. can help, so we should not just really let them down. And particularly addressing this issue of child labor and human exploitation in this month. Now, here's the thing. We have, I think, to look in, we have to be realistic. We have to have this ideal goal, which eventually we hope democracy will prevail. But at the same time, we have to narrow down in terms of how do we actually operationalize this ideal, make it happen. And that would mean having like short and long-term goals and we are having together. And eventually, I'd like to think that the U.S. will prevail over China. Concretely, what we can do, for example, so we have these upcoming DRC elections, this coming up this December. Let's make sure those elections are credible, fair, and transparent, okay? Because the history of these countries have shown that as long as there is this, let's say, issue of illegitimacy of elections, we spend a lot of time, politicians, try to find a solution, 5 years over, here we go back to the next elections. And here's the thing, if we don't do that, for example, China will not come back and say, hey, we would like to know the truth of the election will happen. No, but that legislation can only come back from the United States and from, let's say, our allies, like the European Union, for example. And why this matter for us, and our interest, I like to think that a strong democracy, in longer term, actually will be in our national security interest. And strong democracy in the center of Africa, it's such a big country with enormous potential, great people, by the way, very dynamic, very hardworking people, will offer, I think, a lot of opportunity even for our private companies to go and invest there. So I like to think those are the small things, I think, that will help us eventually prevail over China in longer term into this battle of global power competition. And speaking of what I mentioned earlier in terms of some of the policy in place, such as, as a matter of fact, to them, I think I agree with that, because sometimes I was hearing this word of decoupling, whatever. I think it's a bit, quite frankly, not pragmatic. We cannot really completely decouple from China. If you look at the financial and economic integration, it's almost impossible. But I think using the word of de-risking and the diversifications probably can be doable. And as a matter of fact, I'd like as well to mention the project of electric vehicles. I think the MOU was signed between the US and Zambia, the DRC. Those are the kind of things we need to be supporting. As well, I think the Lobito corridor, that is, I think was agreed upon as well. I think these are the pragmatic projects that if we are serious about, we are engaged about this issue, that actually will help us to prevail over China in this competition.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, as a journalist, I guess that sort of beyond my expertise, but I can offer a few observations. You go down roads between between different towns in the DRC, and you see China aid, you see the Chinese hospital, then you see maybe Japan aid, or this was given by you see very little evidence of sort of US aid and US programs in that part of the world. So I think that that's very important. I also would once again want to say that the protecting of people who are trying to bring information about these mines and about the conditions on these mines to the forefront is very important, because a lot of the time, people will look at a phone or an electric car and not understand where that came from.
So I want to thank the panel. I want to thank the chair on this. I think every American should consider the next time they use their cell phone or jump into an electric vehicle or have a power that is provided by Cobalt, they should look at the supply chain that's provided it. They should recognize immediately that there's a national security interest that's undermining the U.S. ability to influence the world. They should recognize that they're playing a direct role in the exploitation of millions within China, and specifically those in Africa, young children exploited inhumanely, working in a mine far worse than any shoe factory in China, but are being worked literally to their death as indentured servants. America has a leading role to play in this, so does the West, but so does China. And calling them out on these types of issues ensures that not only is Beijing aware of what's happening, but that there will be a cost to pay for the exploitation, for the pillaging of Africa and its children, as well as what we as Americans have a responsibility to do to ensure that this does not happen going forward. Mr. Chair, this is a bipartisan issue. I cannot thank you enough for helping lead the charge and helping to salvage not only America's national security, our economic interests, our industrial strength, but calling out the bad actors of others who would profit on the death of others. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so very much for your eloquent statement and for your excellent questions. Thank you. I'd like to now yield to and recognize Commissioner Salinas. Oh, she's gone. Okay, then I have some questions I'd like to ask, and then we'll conclude. And I thank you for your patience, especially during that interruption during the voting. I wonder how many of the car companies, including Tesla, Ford, GM, and the others, including the United Auto Workers, who, by the way, endorsed me for election. I'm a pro-labor Republican and believe very strongly in labor. But how many of them have spoken up about the supply chain, that the product that they're obviously including in their EVs has been absolutely tainted by child labor and adult forced labor, which has been said a few times here is a crime against humanity. And I'm wondering, where are they? I mean, we're going to ask the UAW to come and testify in a future hearing. We're going to ask the car makers if they'll come forward. This commission has done that with regards to the Genocide Olympics, when we called forth and heard from others like Coca-Cola. But so I'm wondering, have they said anything? Are they, in your opinion, have they been in any way intervening on behalf of the exploited? Nick?
I would say that, yes, some car companies have addressed it. Off the top of my mind, BMW has said that they will only buy cobalt from one mine in Morocco. This has come out in the German press recently. There was some criticisms of that mine in Morocco. And I believe Elon Musk was asked about it and said he was going to put cameras on the heads of children, or cameras in the mines or something like that to stop children going down. I'm not sure what other solutions have been proposed.
Yes.
So if I may, I think we need to recognize the situation. I doubt that there is any Western company that wishes to have this supply chain, to be very frank. Whether they use sufficient pressure is questionable. And the second question is whether they have sufficient pressure over a supply chain which is completely monopolized by China. That said, it is important that there is a joint effort between car companies and the US government to address this issue, because only that joint strength can bring about a resolution of the problem.
Have you witnessed any joint strength coming from the administration?
Well, what I have seen is an aggressive policy of bringing battery production facilities in the United States, which is a good step in the right direction, in my view. I also think it's a good step to start sanctioning actors that, through corruption, are supporting all of these practices, at least indirectly. Whether there is room for improvement, absolutely yes. Sure. Because it cannot be that in 2020, Department of Labor publishes that armed forces of the DRC are effectively complicit in the worst forms of child labor, and there is no reaction.
Let me ask you in terms of prosecutions in the DRC, have there been any of the people that are running the mines, have any Chinese? We had in our last hearing a witness tell us how some of the individuals were whipped by Chinese guards, and there was nothing from his point of view in terms that was done about that. Are there any prosecutions?
If I may just speak to the pattern of how these prosecutions, quote unquote, work, because I cannot call them as somebody who teaches law prosecutions. So they are announced to the general public whenever there is international pressure, such as this hearing or any similar act, mostly coming from Washington. And then after 6 months, the government comes to a resolution, which is in billions and should be paid to selected accounts or selected governmental entities, mostly by the Chinese. So it is just the cost of doing business. There is no serious punishment. There is no actual punishment for the crimes that you mentioned.
Does any of those funds find their way to the exploited person who has been beaten or even killed?
Put it politely, I doubt.
Anybody else know that?
There's also probably a sort of extrajudicial process of deportation for smaller Chinese firms and things like that, and workers that are kicked out. One has to remember as well that quite a lot of the Chinese people who come to DRC are, themselves exploited and themselves kind of living in situations of quite intense poverty that I've seen.
Let me ask you with regards to, I met with Ambassador Lucy Tamerlan, our DR Congo ambassador. Very, very fine person. But we talked about the MOU, and I also raised it with John Kerry at a hearing of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And the concern I have with it, I mean, it's very nice sounding. It's like sense of the Congress language, which we do often hear, or sense of the Senate. But it really, has no teeth. It's aspirational. And while we would love for, and even my bill that's pending and the new one that we're going to do, talks about strategies, which is all great. But frankly, I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And it took me 3 years to get that piece of legislation enacted into law. It was bipartisan. It was vigorously opposed by the Clinton administration. I had the hearings, so I could say without any fear of contradiction. They thought even the tip report would be counterproductive. Naming names would be counterproductive. They said it on the record. And above all, they thought that any kind of sanction would also be fruitless and counterproductive. So Madeleine Albright made it very clear that she was not for the ambassador or the Secretary of State for this sanctions regimen that was included in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. We did prevail, and I've done 20-plus hearings in follow-up. I think it's 35 hearings since. And no one doubts the importance of having at least some sort of Damocles hanging over an offending nation or entity, that they're going to be held to account. It's like a criminal sanction for breaking laws, right here in D.C. or in my own state of New Jersey. You've got to have a penalty phase. So the MOU, nice, but I think 10 years from now we'll say it was nice, but it didn't do anything. So our bill would provide a rebuttable presumption. It is serious. It has a long way to go because it's going to be difficult to get it passed. This administration probably will not support it. Maybe a future one will. But for the sake of those kids, I mean, our Labor Department says 25,000. Others have said 35 to 40,000 kids. There's all different estimates, of course. But lots of children are being exploited. And as you had mentioned, Milosha, very, very young kids as well. We need a penalty phase, if not to do anything else but to get the DR Congolese government to incentivize create their own capability, their own refining capacity, and make the money that they're now shipping off to China and all of that exploitation. It doesn't happen in a day, but I think there needs to be a pivot point, and I think a significant penalty would be one of them. There are, thankfully, some other mines. I don't know how profitable they are in terms of producing product, not money, but how efficacious they are. But it would seem to me that for our critical military means, even for cell phones and other things, there could be a pivot to doing more of those mines. And of course, as you said, Milosh, bring back that capacity here in terms of, but for the DR Congolese, they should do it there. It should be all within the parameters of one country, so they reap the real benefits and not the Chinese Communist Party. And frankly, we're seeing it in other areas where our pharmaceuticals are gravely at risk. We all know that. Antibiotics are at risk. We've had hearings on that as well. So, in a conflict with the PRC, they'll shut off our medical supplies in addition to everything else. So, we're too much beholden to them. And as we all know, they have 5-year plans where they want to monopolize. They do predatory pricing to get there, and they get there. All of a sudden, they own it all. And so I think, I know a lot of people don't like sanctions, but I was for the apartheid sanctions. I was one of the few Republicans early on, I've been here since 1980, who not only voted but spoke out against apartheid, believing passionately that yes, it may hurt some of the Africans, Black Africans, South Africans, but the appalling nature of apartheid was such that that is a means to an end. So I just raised that, this idea of sanctions, your thoughts on that, and our bill of we did the bipartisan, the 4 corners of our commission backed it the strongest, and it did become law. There was pushback from the administration at first, but thankfully Joe Biden did sign it for the legislation with regards to the Uyghurs Forced Labor Act, and that had a rebuttable presumption in it. We've had hearings since on implementation. It's not being implemented in a great way, but it is being implemented. It's very hard, but I think we need to really step up. Your thoughts?
So I guess I will flip it a little bit, because, for me, when I think about sanctions, I tend to see it in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the, sort of the central role that it's playing there. And I think that you're right to raise apartheid as an example as well. There aren't very many instances where sanctions have been successful. And where they have been successful, it's because internationally, the international community is applying the sanctions, not in individual countries. So if we were going to do this in the context of child labor in Congo over Cobalt, we need to have our friends and allies applying those sanctions as well. There needs to be widespread pressure brought to bear. And I think that that's why the sanctions have had an effect in the Russia-Ukraine conflict as well, because they've been widespread, because Europe is with us on this, and that makes a big difference. So that's kind of my...
And I agree with that. When you have global or a lot of buy-in with the European Union and others, it's great. But I'm also the author of the Belarus Democracy Act of 2004, 6, 12, and then the most recent one. When we did the original Belarus Democracy Act, there was pushback galore. Nobody would ever tell Lukashenko what to do. We got it passed. Bush implemented it very, very aggressively, put 200 names right off the bat, including Lukashenko's top cronies on there. Couldn't get a visa, can't do any kind of trade. And to our great, great happiness, all of us, the European Union followed suit and had pretty much the same list. So we got people out of prison, lots of them. Of course, Lukashenko is doing horrible misdeeds now in tandem with Putin, but there was a lot, but it worked, but we led. That's the point I'm getting at. We led. And this idea behind this bill is we want the others to join us. We hope it's not alone. But frankly, if it is, it might save some children. It might get the leadership of the DR Congo to really accelerate taking ownership of their own, the processing of, do that. So it's all, and you don't have child labor or this forced labor for the adults. So but I get your point.
Well, and I take yours too. I think there's no substitute for American leadership. I think that's kind of the message that all 4 of us have shared today.
And we also have done it on GlobalMag, as you know too, Global Magnitsky. And not everybody was on board at that at first, but it has made a difference.
So Chairman, if I may, on the issue of sanctions, I would like just to answer 3 sub-questions, and I think they're going to your point. Absolutely. Firstly, are we obliged to act? And we are obliged to act because there are crimes against humanity and crimes analogous to slavery that are taking place now. And we are also obliged to act in order to protect the national security of the United States and its allies. As a matter of first legal reason, absolutely sanctions can be used. They are countermeasures under international law. They should be used against states, companies, and individuals for acts that we described today. The problem with sanctions is their limited legal nature. Sanctions are temporary and they cannot be punitive, meaning that they should just temporarily halt a wrongful doing from happening, but then we need a solution. And that solution is presently lacking. We need to support US companies to find another supply chain, an alternative supply chain, and build it up. And we also need to have actual meaningful consequences, such as criminal investigations, which will go after those who organize this supply chain and suffering of tens of thousands of kids. Now, the last point that I wanted to raise is I do agree that just US action is limited, but it is incredibly meaningful and it can start the movement. If we look at Global Magnitsky, the problem with Global Magnitsky is not US visas, because these gentlemen either way do not want to come to Washington, D.C. The problem is that every single bank on the face of this planet will have to do know your client rules, and they will not open bank accounts anymore. And the US will have the power through federal criminal law to go after anybody who would allow circumventing the sanctions. This is an immensely powerful tool that can bring even those committing the hardest crimes into compliance. And then the EU and the UK can follow. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just, if you don't mind, sir, just to absolutely substantiate the point that Milo just mentioned here, and I'll just like to...
Is your microphone on?
Yeah, I'd like just to substantiate the point that Milo just mentioned here and try to use a case of, because like, by the way, Congressman, thank you so much for your leadership for between 2015, 16, 18 to lead to election 2018, to get Kabila out. I was following what's going on in Congress, State Department, and I'd like to say thanks largely to the leadership and as well Senator McCain, sadly he passed away, was well really engaged, and thankfully we were able to kind of corner Kabila to respect the constitution of his country and not seek a third illegal term. To coming back to sanctions, just this case of Israel, Dan Gettler, you're going to say it that way. That's a specific example that how U.S. sanctions are very powerful to just bring these guys to reason, say, hey, stop what you're doing, and even beyond that, actually, I think the way I like to phrase this one, in particular in terms of sanctions, we can look them at the, let's say, tactical, operational, strategic level. What that means. At the tactical level, a lot of these, government officials, DRC, they are getting money from Chinese companies to these kind of things. As a matter of fact, I think even the bill you just mentioned already mentioned these kind of things. If we get credible reports that there are certain DRC government officials who have been benefiting from these kind of things, we should sanction them. We should sanction them. As a matter of fact, they are, they like to have the U.S. dollar in their pockets, in their banks, so it's just gonna be easy, to do. So really about that. The other thing I like to mention is in terms of strategic engagement, I like to think that we have the APEC meeting going on in San Francisco, I think yesterday and today. I think in our strategy or policy toward China, we should include in our conversation or talking point with the CCP about these issues. Let's face it, maybe the DRC government might have a bit of more, conflict of interest to do these kind of things. But I'd like to think that, the U.S. President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, engaging with this kind of issue, with the Chinese CCP, I think it's going to have some kind of impact. Of course, along the supply chain, some people are doing some bad stuff, or they are part of a just corrupt, business model, that is perpetuating human exploitations. If we have credible information that anyone or any company is benefiting from these kind of things, we should slap sanctions. So just simply to answer. Yeah.
Just two observations. One, sanctions have been used in the DRC against people in the sector before, especially on Dan Gettler, who was involved in many of the largest copper cobalt mines. And also, just wanted to go back to something that you said in your question, Chairman Smith, whether cobalt can be refined in DRC. One of the big questions there is actually power supply, and to help the DRC refine their cobalt effectively, perhaps some sort of solution to DRC's power supply or engagement with that issue is very important.
Thank you. And on that point, we have passed legislation, I was a co-sponsor of it, called Power Africa. And the whole idea is to try to bring the blessings of power, including to schools and hospitals and homes to the greatest extent possible. So it's a great point that you bring up. It becomes another incentive to up the power capacity of the DR Congo. Just a couple of final questions, and I'll just, the UN role, are they playing a positive role? Is the UN Human Rights Council, for example, investigating, sending in fact-finding teams of any kind? Worker recruitment and retention, how coercive is it, particularly for the children? I mean, when people find out, there's an opportunity here, and then they realize how coercive it is or isn't, if you could speak to that. Can they leave if they wanted to? The idea of payoffs to government officials in the DR Congo, is there any evidence that high-ranking officials are getting bribes? And who's looking into it? Is there any kind of investigative team looking into that other than journalists who take great risks to raise questions and people who are like yourselves, all of you? Who's doing it? Anybody? Yes.
Yeah, I can just talk very quickly on how coercive it is for children. I've interviewed a lot of children who have been down into the mines, and often the pressure comes from the family. It's a poverty-related issue. As Milos said, there's basically no other choice for these families. So, if you're a child and you're basically told to go by your parents, I would say it's sort of fully coercive. Is it coercive on the side of the companies that are buying? No, but basically there's no other option. And then in terms of payoffs, yes, there have been investigations of these Congolese ministers and governors and things like that. But often those are politically motivated. I think we saw the long investigation of former Governor Richard Miege of Lualaba province, which concluded, with a whimper rather than a bang. And I think that, again, it's used as a political tool rather than a real investigative tool in DRC.
Thank you.
So, Chairman, trying to address your questions as they were asked, the United Nations lost all their credibility because they did not examine the cases of mass abuses of people, including rape committed by UN forces in the Congo. And the people themselves do not have any faith in the United Nations in the Congo, though they do recognize that still need peacekeeping forces. But to rely on the United Nations to examine this case, investigate this case, is not something, the card that I would like to play on. The second one is about whether children are forced into working. How I like to compare it is with human trafficking cases. In human trafficking cases, we do not have to have initial force in order to influence a young mind, into compliance. And this is exactly the case of potential human trafficking. So what we have is an effective situation of survival where families are forced either to choose survival or sending their own kids into mines, knowing that those kids will go or may go through sexual abuse, physical abuse, hazardous conditions, and maybe even lose their lives. So to say that we have proofs of initial force bringing them into mines, we do not. But to say that there is no human trafficking and abuse and slavery-alike situation, there is more than enough, because they are effectively by circumstances forced to be there, and they are abused while being there, while not being able to freely choose to leave. Last but not the least, about the corruption situation. Unfortunately, most reports do not come from government officials or governmental bodies. The most recent one came from the Century. It is titled The Back Channel State Capture and Bribery in Congo's Deal of the Century. It goes into great depths of corruption in mining industry and connection between political leaders and corruption. And that is exactly the problem. Again, to my note, that there is no criminal prosecution, that there is no actual act against these stakeholders by means of sanctions or otherwise, and it cannot be that the US government does not have information that Century has.
Gosh, thank you for that answer. And, on the United Nations, when I heard that a number of children in and around Goma were being raped, 12, 13-year-olds, being given one meal in order to, or a very small amount of money. Again, these are 12, 13-year-olds. I held 4 hearings on it, on the UN peacekeepers. I went to Goma. I met with the peacekeepers. I met with everyone involved. And Kofi Annan put out a zero-tolerance policy, and I think it was well-meaning, but it wasn't all that well followed. And I'll never forget, I had a woman at the United Nations, Jane Hall-Lute, who was frustrated. She's an American, and she worked in our military for Pentagon for a while, but she was deployed there, or seconded there. And she did a wonderful job pointing out that there was zero tolerance for zero implementation, I should say, for the zero tolerance policy. Maybe it's gotten better or not, it's hard to say, but you're right about the lack of credibility. When the peacekeepers themselves are, there to mitigate harm and damage and abuse, and they become part of the abusers, or are the abusers, we've got a problem, Houston. And so thank you for bringing that up. But I would hope that the UN, particularly the Human Rights Council, would do more to address this, because the exploitation, as we've all seen, is just horrible. Now, I do have another question just in terms of, are there mines like that Glencore and some of the others run that are more ethical? They may have their own specific problems as well, but it seems to me the demand for cobalt is going to rise exponentially over the years as the demand for EVs rises. I mean, these things don't take all that much, but a car does, and it's a huge amount of cobalt and other minerals. So your thoughts on some of these other mines as alternatives?
I mean, yes. I mean, the Glencore mines are run closer to international standards, and there are also reports that I think there was a report by RAID, which is an NGO, last year that sort of looked more closely at Glencore's employment practices with subcontractors. So there are still issues there. But yes, there's less of an issue. There is a big question about what battery technology is being used in electric vehicles. I will note that already half of China's EVs are lithium-ion phosphate batteries, which actually have no cobalt. But they have another issue, which is phosphate supply chain. So that's an important trend to watch. Just going back to actually something that Milos said, I'd just like to also highlight the important work of Congolese NGOs such as AfroWatch, PODIFIP, and the civil society in Congo in holding people to account and really publishing reports and doing investigations that are very, very dangerous for them, more dangerous even than Western journalists coming into the country.
So, Chairman, coming to Glencore mines, I do not have any information, any credible information that Glencore mines have ever been involved in child labor or any similar practices. What we need, however, to recognize is that we talk about up to 2 mines. This is not a source of cobalt, or we do not have enough cobalt, even if the entire production of Glencore is going into the United States. That is not enough. Out of the largest 14 mines, at least 8 are Chinese controlled. And I say at least because this is public information. Most likely it is much higher than that. And this is the core of the issue, because even if Glencore does use free of slavery or free of child labor mines, they still need to refine it somewhere, and that can be mixed with minerals coming from other facilities, which is a problem.
Yeah, I just want to add that, it can be mixed in China without much, it's not necessarily happening in the DRC. It can happen overseas.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude the hearing? Thank you for giving us so much of your time, and above all, your expertise and your leadership is extraordinary, each of you. So thank you. The hearing is adjourned.